In the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Margaret Henderson's peaceful life with her golden retriever Coconut was about to take an extraordinary turn. Nothing could have prepared her for that crisp October morning when Coconut brought home a most unexpected friend. There, pressed against her backyard fence, was the most beautiful young bobcat she'd ever seen. Not hunting, not territorial, but gazing at Coconut with an expression that could only be described as pure adoration. Day after day, this wild creature returned, not for food or shelter, but for something far more precious: friendship. Their bond is a gentle reminder that love doesn't need words or walls. It only needs kindness, time, and an open heart. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Margaret Henderson had lived in the small town of Cedar Falls, Montana for 67 years. She'd seen drought years that cracked the earth like broken pottery, winters that froze pipes solid for weeks, and spring floods that sent deer tiptoeing through her vegetable garden. But in all those decades, she had never seen anything quite like what happened on that crisp October morning when her golden retriever, Coconut, brought home a friend. The warning signs had been there for weeks. Strange prints in the mud beside her back porch. Her neighbor's chickens clucking nervously through the night. The occasional glimpse of tawny fur darting between the pine trees that lined the back of her property. Margaret had figured it was probably a coyote. They'd been moving closer to town in recent years, following the easy pickings of garbage cans and pet food left outside. She'd been extra careful with Coconut's evening walks, keeping her on a leash and carrying her father's old flashlight. At 12 years old, Coconut was still spry enough to chase squirrels, but Margaret worried about her aging retriever tangling with something wild and dangerous. The morning it all changed started like any other. Margaret woke at dawn, made her coffee, and let Coconut out into the fenced backyard while she prepared breakfast. She was stirring scrambled eggs when she heard it, a sound she'd never heard Coconut make before. Not barking, not whining, but something between a purr and a chortle, full of delight and excitement. Margaret set down her spatula and peered through the kitchen window. Coconut was at the back fence, her tail wagging so hard her whole body wiggled. And there, just on the other side of the chain link, sat the most beautiful young bobcat Margaret had ever seen. Her first instinct was to rush outside and drag Coconut to safety. But something about the scene made her pause. The bobcat, clearly a juvenile, maybe 8 or 9 months old, was lying on his side, paws tucked under his chin, golden eyes fixed on Coconut with what could only be described as adoration. His tufted ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. His spotted coat gleamed in the morning sun. As Margaret watched, transfixed, the bobcat made a soft churring sound, almost like a house cat's purr, but deeper, wilder. Coconut responded with another of those strange chortle sounds, pressing herself against the fence. The young bobcat stretched one paw through the chain link, not to swipe, but to gently touch Coconut's nose. Margaret held her breath. This was impossible. Bobcats didn't just stroll up to domestic dogs for morning greetings. They were solitary creatures, cautious of humans and their pets. Yet here was this young male. She could tell by his size and the broader set of his face, acting more like a love-struck teenager than a wild predator. She stepped onto the back porch, her movement causing the bobcat's head to snap toward her. For a moment, they regarded each other across the yard. Margaret expected him to bolt, but instead, he simply watched her with those enormous golden eyes, his expression calm and unafraid. Then, As if satisfied that she posed no threat, he turned his attention back to Coconut. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes. The bobcat played a gentle game with Coconut, reaching through the fence to bat at a stick she brought him, even rolling over to show his spotted belly when Coconut's excitement reached fever pitch. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he stood, touched noses with Coconut one last time, and melted into the trees. Margaret walked to the fence where Coconut still waited, hoping for her friend's return. "What in the world, girl?" she murmured, scratching behind her dog's ears. Coconut looked up at her with bright eyes, tail still wagging, as if to say, "Wasn't he wonderful?" That evening, Margaret called her son David in Seattle. A wildlife biologist, he'd always been her go-to for questions about the creatures that shared her mountain home. "Mom, that's unusual," David said after she described the morning's encounter. "Bobcats typically avoid domestic animals, especially dogs. He was probably just curious. I wouldn't worry about it unless he becomes aggressive." But the bobcat returned the next morning, and the morning after that. By the fourth day, Margaret had stopped being surprised to find him waiting by the fence when she let Coconut out. She'd taken to watching from the kitchen window, marveling at the unlikely pair. The bobcat, she'd started thinking of him as Bubba, a name that somehow suited his rugged appearance combined with his unexpectedly gentle nature, seemed to have adopted Coconut as his best friend. He'd arrive just after dawn, settle beside the fence, and wait. The moment Coconut bounded outside, his whole demeanor would change. His ears would perk up, his tail would twitch with excitement, and he'd make that strange churring sound. Their play sessions became more elaborate. Bubba would bring Coconut presents, a particularly nice stick, an interesting rock, once a bedraggled tennis ball he'd found somewhere. Coconut, not to be outdone, began carrying her toys to the fence to show him. Margaret watched them play a version of fetch, with Bubba batting objects back and forth through the chain link. The other neighbors had noticed too. Ellen Morrison, who lived next door, mentioned seeing the bobcat crossing her yard. "Strangest thing," Ellen said over the fence one afternoon. "He just walked right past my chickens, didn't even look at them, almost like he was in a hurry to get somewhere important." That somewhere, Margaret realized, was her backyard. To see Coconut. As October turned to November, Margaret found herself genuinely looking forward to Bubba's visits. There was something magical about watching the growing friendship between her domestic dog and this wild creature. Coconut had been showing signs of her age, moving more slowly on walks, sleeping more, less interested in her toys. But Bubba's presence had given her new life. She waited by the fence every morning, whined with joy whenever she spotted him through the windows, and had more energy than she'd shown in months. The first time Bubba joined them on a walk, Margaret nearly turned around and went home. She was leading Coconut down the quiet dirt road that ran behind their property when she heard a rustle in the brush. Suddenly, Bubba emerged from the trees, falling into step about 20 feet behind them. Margaret's heart hammered, but Coconut was ecstatic, turning to look back at her friend every few steps. Bubba maintained his distance, never approaching the humans but clearly enjoying the shared walk. He'd disappear into the underbrush when they encountered other people or dogs, only to reappear once the coast was clear. Soon, his presence on their walks became routine. Martha Webb, the town librarian, stopped Margaret one afternoon as she was returning from a walk. "That bobcat," Martha said, her eyes wide. "I've been hearing stories. People say he follows you and Coconut around like a guard dog." "He's harmless," Margaret replied, though she understood the concern. "He keeps his distance, never approaches people, never causes any trouble. That was true. Despite his growing boldness around Coconut and Margaret, Bubba remained wild enough to respect human boundaries. He never approached if there were children around, never lingered in yards where he wasn't welcome, and always gave humans plenty of space. The weather turned colder as November progressed. Margaret worried about Bubba spending nights outside, especially when the first snow began to fall. She'd started leaving a small covered area on her back porch, just in case. An old dog bed she'd found in the basement, protected by a plastic tarp. She never saw him use it during the day, but sometimes, when she woke in the morning, there would be a perfectly round depression in the bed and a few tawny hairs that caught the light. It was David who finally explained Bubba's behavior when he came home for Thanksgiving. "He's probably an orphan," David said, watching Bubba and Coconut play through the kitchen window. "Based on his size, I'd guess he's around 10 months old. If something happened to his mother when he was young, maybe 4 or 5 months, he would have had to learn to survive on his own. But he was still in that critical socialization period. Being around your house, seeing Coconut, it became normal for him." "So he's not dangerous?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Anyone could see the gentle nature of this particular wild animal. "Every wild animal is potentially dangerous, Mom. But this one..." David shook his head admiringly. "This one has chosen domesticity in a way. Not fully. He's still wild. But he's formed a bond that's overriding his instincts." As winter deepened, Margaret watched that bond grow stronger. Bubba began spending entire days in her yard when storms hit. She'd find him napping under the covered porch, Coconut curled up just inside the back door, both of them taking comfort in the other's proximity even with glass between them. The day Coconut got sick, Bubba seemed to know. Margaret had noticed her dog moving more slowly than usual, refusing her breakfast, lying in uncomfortable positions as if her joints ached. When she called the veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen confirmed what Margaret had feared. Coconut's arthritis was getting worse. At 13, she was experiencing the inevitable decline of age. That afternoon, as Coconut rested on her bed inside, Bubba appeared at the fence earlier than usual. He didn't wait for his usual playmate to come outside. Instead, he seemed to sense something was wrong. He paced the fence line, making soft sounds, not his usual chirr of greeting, but something more worried, more mournful. Margaret opened the back door. "She's resting, Bubba," she said softly. "She doesn't feel well today." As if he understood, the Bobcat settled beside the fence and waited. He stayed there all day, a faithful sentinel, even when it began to rain. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. She opened the back door and, after a moment's hesitation, unlatched the fence gate. "Come on," she said quietly. "She'd want to see you." Bubba approached slowly, his wild instincts warring with his desire to comfort his friend. He followed Margaret to where Coconut lay on her bed just inside the door. Without hesitation, he curled up beside her, still outside, respecting the boundary between wild and domestic, but close enough that Coconut could rest her head against his warm fur. They stayed like that through the night. Margaret dozed fitfully in her recliner nearby, marveling at the trust both animals had placed in her. When dawn broke, Bubba quietly slipped away, but not before gently nudging Coconut's face with his nose. A wild creature's version of a get-well kiss. Coconut's health improved with the medication doctor. Chen prescribed, and their routine resumed. But something had changed. The bond between all three of them, woman, dog, and Bobcat, had deepened beyond simple friendship. As winter gave way to spring, Margaret realized how profoundly Bubba had changed her life. She'd been lonely since her husband Harry's death 2 years ago. Coconut had been good company, but the house had felt too quiet, too empty. Bubba's presence had brought a sense of wonder back into her days. She found herself looking forward to mornings again, eager to see what new interaction would unfold in her backyard. The town had grown accustomed to their unusual friend, too. Children would sometimes ask their parents if they could come watch Bubba play with Coconut. Margaret always said yes, as long as they stayed at a safe distance. She'd seen how Bubba could bring the same sense of wonder to others that he'd brought to her. One afternoon in April, as Margaret was gardening, she heard Coconut's excited chortle. Looking up, she saw Bubba approaching, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, at a cautious distance, was another Bobcat, an adult female. Margaret's heart clenched. Was this his mother? Another wild cat who might lead him away? But as she watched, it became clear this was something different. The female was heavily pregnant, clearly nearing the end of her term. Bubba approached her fence, made his usual greeting sounds to Coconut, then turned back to the female. The exchange was brief. A few soft vocalizations, some gentle touching of noses. Then the female melted back into the forest. David was visiting that weekend. When Margaret described what she'd seen, he smiled. "He's introducing them," David said. "Bobcats typically live alone, but he's learned different behavior from watching you and Coconut. He's showing the female that this is a safe place." The female, Margaret started thinking of her as Belle, began appearing occasionally. Unlike Bubba, she maintained a much greater distance, but she seemed comfortable watching Bubba's interactions with the domesticated pair. In late April, she appeared again, this time with 2 tiny kittens. They stayed at the edge of the trees, but Margaret could see them clearly through her binoculars. Bubba approached his family, touched noses with each kitten, then returned to the fence where Coconut waited. It was then that Margaret understood the full scope of what had happened. Bubba hadn't just found friendship with Coconut. He'd found a model for how to be both wild and connected, how to maintain bonds across species, how to create family in unexpected ways. As spring progressed into summer, Margaret's backyard became a gathering place of sorts. Belle and the kittens would appear periodically, always keeping to the forest edge. Bubba continued his daily visits with Coconut. The neighbors grew accustomed to the sight, stopping by sometimes just to witness what one visitor called a daily miracle. Ellen Morrison brought her granddaughter one afternoon. "It's like a fairy tale," the little girl whispered. "A dog and a kitty cat being best friends, but the kitty cat is wild." That's exactly what it was, Margaret realized. A fairy tale made real, proving that connection and love could exist in the most unlikely circumstances. On Coconut's 14th birthday, a milestone Margaret hadn't been sure she'd reach, Bubba arrived with a present. A perfectly round stone, smooth from the creek, which he deposited ceremoniously at the fence. Coconut picked it up, carried it proudly around the yard, then brought it back to share with him. That evening, as Margaret watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Coconut sleeping peacefully on her bed, and Bubba resting just outside the open door, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. This unlikely friendship had shown her that isolation was a choice, that family could take any form, and that wonder could appear at any moment. You just had to be open to seeing it. Bubba never did become domesticated. As autumn returned, then winter again, he remained wild at heart. But every day, without fail, he returned to the fence where Coconut waited. Their friendship had created ripples throughout the community, reminding everyone that love didn't require similarity, that trust could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most profound connections came from the most unexpected places. As Margaret settled into her second year of this magical routine, she knew that whatever time she had left, whether years or decades, would be blessed by the daily proof that miracles were real. They arrived quietly, on 4 paws, at dawn, and asked for nothing more than an open heart and a place to call home. In Cedar Falls, Montana, where the town motto was, "Where mountain meets prairie," a new legend had been born. It wasn't written in any official record, but everyone knew the story of Bubba and Coconut, the wild bobcat and gentle golden retriever who proved that friendship knows no boundaries. And every morning, when the sun crested the mountains and painted the valley in gold, Margaret Henderson would make her coffee, let her dog outside, and wait for their miraculous friend to appear at the fence, ready for another day of impossible, beautiful friendship. In loving memory of all the unlikely friendships that teach us that home isn't just a place. It's wherever love is freely given and gratefully received. In Pinewood, Oregon, where the city meets the Cascade Mountains, the line between urban life and wilderness is thin. Officer Jake Monroe, a 20-year veteran of the Pinewood Police Department, has spent decades patrolling this boundary. Raised by a forest ranger, Jake has always felt a deep connection to nature. But what awaited him in that abandoned factory would challenge everything he thought he knew about the wild. A desperate cry echoing through crumbling walls. A precarious ledge 20 feet above concrete. And trapped between certain death and an uncertain rescue. A young bobcat with amber eyes that seem to plead for help. Some say wild animals don't remember. That they don't form bonds with humans. That the boundary between our worlds can never truly be crossed. Officer Jake Monroe knows differently. This is the remarkable true story of a rescue that came full circle, proving that compassion, even shown to the wildest of creatures, may someday find its way home. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The late autumn sun cast long shadows across Pinewood, a mid-sized city nestled against the foothills of the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. The city had grown considerably over the past decade, with new housing developments steadily encroaching upon the wilderness that had once defined the region. It was this delicate balance between urban expansion and wild terrain that Officer Jake Monroe knew all too well. At 43, Jake had spent the better part of 2 decades with the Pinewood Police Department. His weathered face, etched with the fine lines of experience, spoke of countless hours patrolling the city's boundaries where civilization met wilderness. The son of a forest ranger, Jake had grown up with a deep respect for wildlife and often volunteered with local conservation efforts when off duty. On this particular Wednesday in November, Jake was nearing the end of his shift, patrolling the Eastern District where several old industrial buildings stood scheduled for demolition. The area had once been a thriving manufacturing hub in the 1970s, but had fallen into disrepair as businesses moved operations overseas. The radio in his patrol car crackled with routine chatter as he drove slowly past the old Westmore textile factory, a sprawling brick structure that had been partially dismantled the previous week. Something caught his attention, a faint, distressed sound carrying on the crisp autumn air. Jake pulled his vehicle to the curb, lowered his window, and listened intently. There it was again, a high-pitched, urgent cry that didn't sound human, yet conveyed unmistakable distress. Jake reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Monroe. I'm at the old Westmore building on East Pine, hearing some unusual sounds inside the structure. Going to check it out." "Copy that, Officer Monroe," came the response. "Be advised that building is marked unsafe. Proceed with caution. Do you need backup?" Jake hesitated, scanning the building's facade. "Negative at this time. We'll advise if needed." Grabbing his flashlight and securing his utility belt, Jake approached the chain-link fence surrounding the property. A large "No Trespassing" sign hung from the padlocked gate, but Jake noticed a section where the fence had been pulled away, creating a gap large enough for someone, or something, to slip through. The cries grew more distinct as he approached the main entrance, its doors long removed and leaving a gaping mouth into the building's shadowy interior. Jake flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through dust particles dancing in the air. "Hello? Anyone in here?" His voice echoed through the cavernous space. The answering cry came from somewhere above, a sound that Jake now recognized was not human at all. It held the distinctive pitch of a feline in distress, but deeper and more guttural than any house cat. Moving carefully through the debris-strewn floor, Jake made his way toward a metal staircase that clung precariously to the wall. Each step creaked ominously beneath his weight, but held firm as he ascended to the second floor. The building's second level was in worse condition than the first. Large sections of the floor had been removed, creating dangerous pits that plunged straight to the concrete below. The demolition crew had been in the middle of their work when they'd left for the day, leaving behind a treacherous maze of exposed beams and crumbling plaster. The cries led Jake toward the eastern wall, where large windows, most with broken panes, overlooked the forest beyond the city limits. As he approached, his flashlight beam finally illuminated the source of the distress. Perched on a narrow ledge created by a partially collapsed section of wall was a young bobcat, its tawny fur speckled with the distinctive dark spots of adolescence. The creature couldn't have been more than 6 months old, barely more than a kitten, and its amber eyes reflected the flashlight's beam with a terrified glow. Jake immediately understood the predicament. The ledge the young bobcat occupied was part of an interior wall that had once separated rooms, but now stood exposed due to the demolition. Below the ledge was a 20-foot drop to the bare concrete. The animal was effectively trapped, too frightened to attempt a leap that could prove fatal. "Well, hello there," Jake said softly, keeping his distance but assessing the situation. The bobcat hissed in response, backing as far as it could against the wall, its small body trembling. Jake reached for his radio. "Dispatch, Officer Monroe. I've located the source of the sounds. Got a juvenile bobcat trapped on a ledge inside the building. Looks like it might have wandered in from the woods nearby and got itself stuck when the demolition made its exit route unstable." "Copy that. Do you want me to contact Animal Control?" Jake glanced at his watch. It was nearly 6 p.m., and he knew the local animal control office would be minimally staffed at this hour. By the time they arrived and assessed the situation, it might be too late for the frightened animal. "Negative. I'm going to see if I can handle this myself. The ledge doesn't look stable, and this little one's getting more agitated. Request backup from Officer Ramirez if he's still in the area. He's got experience with the Wildlife Rescue Group." "Copy that. Officer Ramirez is approximately 10 minutes from your location. We'll redirect." Jake pocketed his radio and considered his options. The bobcat was about 15 feet away, on a ledge that could be reached by carefully traversing an exposed beam. The risk was substantial, not just from the potential fall, but from the frightened wild animal itself. Even a juvenile bobcat possessed sharp claws and teeth capable of inflicting serious injury. From his utility belt, Jake removed a pair of heavy-duty gloves he kept for handling sharp objects during searches. They weren't ideal for animal handling, but offered better protection than nothing. He also retrieved a small package of beef jerky he'd been saving for a snack. "All right, little one," he murmured. "Let's see if we can find some common ground here." Tearing off a small piece of jerky, Jake tossed it onto the ledge, well away from himself, but within the bobcat's reach. The animal's nose twitched, catching the scent of meat, but it remained frozen in place, eyes fixed on Jake. Moving with deliberate slowness, Jake began to edge his way along the beam that led toward the ledge. The wood groaned beneath his weight, sending a shower of dust and small debris to the floor below. "Officer Monroe," the voice echoed from the stairwell. "Up here, Ramirez," Jake called back, not taking his eyes off the bobcat. "Second floor, east wall. Move carefully, floor's not stable." Officer Miguel Ramirez appeared moments later, his stocky frame moving with surprising agility through the obstacle course of the demolition site. At 35, Ramirez was one of the department's most respected officers and, like Jake, harbored a passion for wildlife conservation. "Well, would you look at that?" Ramirez whispered, taking in the scene. "How'd it get in here?" "Probably through that gap in the fence," Jake replied. "Found some tracks in the dust downstairs. Must have been exploring and got spooked when it couldn't find its way back out." Ramirez nodded, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. "That ledge doesn't look like it'll hold much longer. Vibrations from the demolition probably weakened it." As if to emphasize his point, a small chunk of plaster broke free from beneath the bobcat's paws, plummeting to the concrete below. The animal cried out again, pressing itself flatter against the wall. "I've got a rescue carrier in my trunk," Ramirez offered. "Standard equipment for the wildlife volunteer team. Give me 5 minutes." While Ramirez hurried back to his vehicle, Jake continued his careful approach. "Easy now," he soothed, his voice deliberately calm and low. "We're going to get you out of here, but you've got to trust me a little." The bobcat's eyes never left him, but its posture shifted slightly, less defensive, more attentive. Jake tossed another small piece of jerky closer to the animal. This time, the bobcat stretched forward cautiously, sniffing the offering before quickly snatching it up. "That's it," Jake encouraged. "Just a little cooperation, that's all I'm asking." By the time Ramirez returned with a large pet carrier and a thick blanket, Jake had positioned himself within a few feet of the ledge. The bobcat had accepted several pieces of jerky, but remained wary, muscles tensed for escape. That wasn't possible. "How do you want to play this?" Ramirez asked, keeping his voice low. Jake considered their options. "The ledge won't support both of us. I'll continue forward, try to get the blanket around it. Once I have a secure hold, I'll pass it back to you for the carrier." Ramirez nodded, handing the blanket to Jake. "Be careful with those claws. Bobcats this age can still do some serious damage." Jake slowly unfurled the blanket, holding it stretched between his hands. The bobcat's ears flattened against its head, a low growl emanating from its throat. I know, Jake murmured. "This isn't ideal for either of us, but it's the best option we've got." With a deep breath, Jake made his final approach. The beam beneath him shifted slightly, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. The bobcat sensed the change, its muscles bunching as if preparing to leap, a jump that would almost certainly result in injury or worse. Jake lunged forward, throwing the blanket over the animal in one swift motion. The bobcat yowled in protest, twisting and thrashing beneath the fabric as Jake carefully gathered the corners, creating a secure bundle with the frightened creature inside. The ledge chose that moment to give way completely. Jake felt the sickening sensation of falling, his body pitching forward into empty space. With one hand clutching the bundled bobcat, he reached desperately for support with the other, fingers scraping against rough brick and finding purchase on an exposed piece of rebar. "Monroe!" Ramirez shouted, rushing forward as far as he safely could. Jake hung suspended, one arm straining to hold his weight, the other cradling the struggling bundle containing the bobcat. "Stay back," he commanded through gritted teeth. "Floor won't hold us both." The muscles in his shoulders screamed in protest as he dangled 20 feet above the concrete floor. The bobcat had gone still within the blanket, perhaps sensing the precariousness of their situation. "There's a beam about 2 feet to your right," Ramirez directed. "If you can swing toward it, I think you can get your footing." Summoning his remaining strength, Jake began to swing his body, pendulum-like, toward the beam Ramirez had indicated. On the third swing, his feet made contact, finding precarious purchase on the narrow wood. "That's it," Ramirez encouraged. "Now work your way along it toward me." With excruciating slowness, Jake inched his way along the beam, one hand still gripping the rebar, the other clutching the bundled bobcat against his chest. He could feel the rapid heartbeat of the frightened animal through the blanket. When he finally reached a section of stable flooring, Ramirez grasped his uniform shirt and hauled him to safety. Both officers collapsed onto the dusty floor, breathing heavily. "The cat?" Ramirez asked between breaths. Jake carefully loosened his grip on the bundle. The blanket shifted, and a pair of amber eyes peered out, wide with fear but apparently unharmed. "Looks okay," Jake confirmed. "Let's get it in the carrier before it decides to thank me with its claws." Together, they managed to transfer the bobcat to the carrier, securing the door before removing the blanket completely. The young animal pressed itself against the back of the enclosure, its sides heaving with rapid breaths but otherwise appearing uninjured. "What's the plan?" Ramirez asked as they carefully made their way back down the treacherous staircase, Jake carrying the carrier with its precious cargo. "There's that wildlife rehabilitation center about 40 minutes north of here," Jake replied. "The one run by Dr. Elaine Sanders. They specialize in treating and releasing local predator species." "Good call. Wanting to take it?" "Your shift ended 20 minutes ago." Jake shook his head, feeling an inexplicable connection to the frightened creature. "I've got this. I'll file the report tomorrow." The drive to the Northern Cascades Wildlife Rehabilitation Center took Jake through winding mountain roads as daylight faded into dusk. Occasionally, he glanced at the carrier secured in his passenger seat, catching glimpses of the bobcat's reflective eyes watching him warily from within. The center's grounds were nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, its buildings designed to blend harmoniously with the natural environment. Despite the late hour, lights still burned in the main treatment facility. Dr. Elaine Sanders met Jake at the entrance, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, deep lines around her eyes speaking of decades spent in sun and wind. At 68, she showed no signs of slowing her lifelong dedication to wildlife conservation. "Officer Monroe," she greeted him warmly. Miguel called ahead. "Let's see what you've brought us." In the examination room, Elaine carefully transferred the bobcat to a special handling enclosure where she could examine it without risk of escape. The animal had calmed somewhat during the journey, but still hissed defensively when the carrier door opened. "Female, approximately 6 months old," Elaine noted, observing the bobcat through the enclosure's clear panels. "Appears healthy at first glance, but we'll do a full workup." "Will she be releasable?" Jake asked, surprising himself with how much he cared about the answer. Elaine studied the bobcat thoughtfully. "Barring any health issues, yes. She's young, but old enough to have learned hunting skills from her mother. The fact that she was afraid of you is actually a good sign. Means she hasn't habituated to humans." Relief washed over Jake. "Where will you release her?" "We have an arrangement with the Forest Service for releases in the Eastern Cascade Preserve. It's protected land, about 30 miles from human settlements. Plenty of prey, water, and territory for a young bobcat to establish herself." Jake nodded, satisfied. He found himself reluctant to leave, watching as the bobcat prowled the perimeter of her temporary enclosure. Elaine noticed his lingering presence. "You know, we always need volunteers for releases. It's quite something to see them return to the wild." "I'd like that," Jake replied without hesitation. "Just let me know when." Over the next 3 weeks, Jake found himself visiting the rehabilitation center frequently during his off hours. The young Bobcat, whom the staff had nicknamed Ledge in honor of her rescue location, had indeed proved healthy. Dr. Sanders had confirmed she was simply a victim of curiosity and bad timing, having wandered into the building and become disoriented when her exit route collapsed during demolition. Jake observed as Ledge gradually regained her confidence, moving from the stress of captivity to a calculated wariness that was natural for her species. In the center's large pre-release enclosure, she demonstrated proficient hunting skills, easily catching the live prey introduced to prepare her for independence. "She's ready," Elaine informed Jake one crisp December morning. "We're planning the release for tomorrow at dawn. Still interested in joining us?" Jake rearranged his schedule without hesitation, arriving at the center while stars still punctuated the pre-dawn sky. Ledge had been carefully transferred to a specialized transport carrier, designed to open from a distance via a pulley system, allowing the animal to emerge on her own terms without human proximity. The release site was a beautiful meadow bordered by dense forest in the Eastern Cascade Preserve. Jake helped carry the carrier deep into the area, setting it down facing the tree line as the first rays of sunlight crested the mountains. "Ready?" Elaine asked, handing Jake the pulley cord. "You did the rescuing. Seems fitting you should do the releasing." With a nod, Jake gently pulled the cord. The carrier door swung open smoothly, but Ledge remained inside, cautious. The small group of humans retreated to a respectful distance, waiting. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the Bobcat finally emerged, her movements deliberate and alert. She paused at the carrier's threshold, amber eyes scanning her surroundings, nose testing the air. In one fluid motion, she bounded across the meadow and disappeared into the forest, offering one final glance back at the humans who had intervened in her fate. In that brief moment of eye contact, Jake felt an unexpected connection, a mutual acknowledgement between two very different beings whose paths had crossed under extraordinary circumstances. "That's what makes this job worthwhile," Elaine said softly beside him, knowing she has her whole life ahead of her, where she belongs. Life returned to its normal rhythm for Jake Monroe. Winter deepened across Oregon, bringing heavy snows to the Cascades and steady rain to Pinewood. The incident with the Bobcat became a story he occasionally shared with colleagues, a reminder of why he'd become an officer in the first place, to protect all the inhabitants of his community, human or otherwise. March arrived with its promise of spring, melting the winter accumulation and swelling the rivers that coursed through the region. The increased moisture brought its own dangers, saturating the ground and destabilizing the geological features that characterized the area. On the 15th of March, shortly after 2 a.m., residents of Pinewood were jolted awake by the unmistakable shuddering of an earthquake. At 5.7 magnitude, it wasn't catastrophic by West Coast standards, but for a community built partially on reclaimed wetlands, the impact was significant. Jake was awakened by the emergency alert on his phone, followed immediately by a call from dispatch. Within 20 minutes, he was in his patrol car, navigating streets littered with debris from damaged structures. All available units to Riverside Apartments on Maple Street. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. Structure compromise reported with possible entrapment. Fire and rescue en route. The Riverside Apartments was an older complex, built in the 1960s before modern seismic codes were implemented. As Jake pulled up to the scene, he immediately spotted the damage. A significant portion of the east wing had collapsed, creating a pile of concrete, wood, and personal belongings. Residents in various states of dress huddled in the parking lot, some crying, others calling out names of missing neighbors. Jake quickly joined the other first responders in establishing a perimeter and accounting for residents. "We're missing at least 4 people from the East Wing," Fire Captain Reynolds informed the assembled emergency personnel. "Structural engineers on the way, but we can't wait. We're organizing search teams now." Jake was paired with a firefighter named Collins, assigned to check the section nearest the collapse for survivors who might be trapped in partially damaged apartments. They worked methodically, calling out as they entered each unit, helping disoriented residents to safety. On the 3rd floor, they encountered an elderly man pinned beneath a fallen bookcase, unable to reach his walker. After freeing him and ensuring he could be evacuated safely by another team, Jake continued down the hallway alone while Collins escorted the man to the stairwell. The building groaned ominously, dust filtering down from new cracks in the ceiling. Jake knew he should wait for his partner's return, but the sound of faint crying from the next apartment spurred him forward. Inside, he found a mother clutching a toddler, both trapped in the bathroom where falling debris had blocked the door. With adrenaline-fueled strength, Jake cleared enough material to create an opening. "You need to come out now," he urged. "The building's not stable." The woman passed her child through the gap to Jake. As she began to follow, an aftershock rumbled through the structure. Jake had just enough time to shield the child with his body as the ceiling above them gave way. When the dust settled, Jake found himself in near-total darkness, a crushing weight across his lower body and the terrified cries of the child somewhere nearby but out of reach. Pain radiated from his pinned legs, and when he attempted to move, the debris shifted dangerously. "Collins," he shouted. "Anyone? We're here. 3rd floor, east side." His flashlight had been knocked from his hand in the collapse, but he could just make out its beam several feet away, illuminating swirling dust particles. The child's cries grew more distant. Someone must have reached her from another direction and carried her to safety. Jake's radio had been crushed in the fall. Alone in the darkness, he focused on controlling his breathing and assessing his situation. The weight across his legs wasn't causing critical pain, suggesting they weren't crushed, but merely pinned. The real danger was the unstable debris above him. Any rescue attempt could trigger a further collapse. Time became fluid in the darkness. Jake drifted in and out of awareness, the pain and restricted circulation to his legs occasionally jolting him back to full consciousness. He called out periodically, but heard no response beyond the distant sounds of rescue operations elsewhere in the building. It could have been minutes or hours later when Jake became aware of an odd scratching sound above him. At first, he dismissed it as settling debris or his own disorientation. But the sound continued, purposeful and rhythmic. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse from dust and thirst. The scratching paused briefly, then resumed with increased intensity. Dust and small pieces of material began to filter down near Jake's head. Someone, or something, was digging. Jake's first thought was of rescue dogs. The local fire department had 2 trained search and rescue canines that might have picked up his scent. But as a small opening appeared in the debris above him, allowing a shaft of emergency lighting to penetrate his dark prison, what he saw made his breath catch. A pair of amber eyes peered down at him. Unmistakable eyes he had looked into months before. "Impossible," Jake whispered. The Bobcat, it had to be Ledge, though she had grown considerably, continued to dig at the opening, her powerful paws working methodically to widen the gap. How she had come to be in an urban apartment building during an earthquake defied logic, but Jake's pain-clouded mind couldn't focus on that mystery now. The opening grew larger as the Bobcat cleared away smaller pieces of debris. She worked with surprising precision, as if understanding the precariousness of the larger pieces that still trapped Jake. Occasionally, she would disappear from view, only to return moments later to continue her efforts. A shaft of more intense light suddenly joined the ambient glow, accompanied by human voices. "I swear I heard animal sounds over here," someone was saying. "In an apartment building? During an earthquake?" Another voice responded skeptically. "Just help me check this section." The thermal imaging showed something alive beneath this spot. The Bobcat froze at the human voices, her eyes locked with Jake's in a moment of silent communication. Then, with fluid grace, she retreated from the opening she had created. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice stronger now with renewed hope. "I'm down here. Officer Monroe, PPD. We've got a live one." The voice above grew excited. "Officer trapped below debris. Alert medical and get the extraction team." The rescue that followed was methodical and tense. The opening the Bobcat had started provided the rescue team with a crucial access point, allowing them to assess Jake's situation and strategize the safest way to free him without triggering a secondary collapse. 3 hours later, Jake was finally extracted from the rubble, his legs bruised and swollen but remarkably intact. As paramedics stabilized him on a stretcher, he kept searching the perimeter of the rescue scene. "Did you see it?" he asked one of the firefighters who had helped free him. "The Bobcat." The man gave him a concerned look, clearly attributing the question to shock or confusion. "No wildlife reported at the scene, officer. You're in downtown Pinewood." Jake fell silent, wondering if he had hallucinated the amber eyes and scratching paws. But as the stretcher was being loaded into the ambulance, he caught a glimpse of movement atop the building across the street. A distinctive tawny form with a bobbed tail, observing the scene from a safe distance before melting away into the pre-dawn shadows. Recovery took time. Jake's injuries, while not life-threatening, required weeks of physical therapy to restore full mobility to his legs. During his convalescence, he repeatedly recounted the story of the Bobcat's intervention to his fellow officers, most of whom responded with polite skepticism. "Bobcats don't come into the city center, Monroe," Chief Wilson had said kindly but firmly. "And they certainly don't remember humans or attempt to save them. You were oxygen-deprived and in shock." Only Miguel Ramirez seemed willing to entertain the possibility. "Wildlife behavior isn't always what we expect," he said during one of his visits to Jake's hospital room. "There are documented cases of wild animals forming unusual attachments or demonstrating unexpected behaviors towards specific humans." Whether anyone believed him or not, Jake knew what he had experienced. As soon as he was physically able, he began making regular drives to the eastern edge of Pinewood where urban development yielded to wilderness, the transitional zone where a bobcat might venture. On his fifth such excursion, nearly 2 months after the earthquake, Jake's persistence was rewarded. As he sat on the hood of his car at sunset, overlooking the valley where the city met the forest, movement at the tree line caught his attention. The bobcat emerged cautiously, larger than he remembered from the rehabilitation center, but with the same distinctive markings. She paused at the forest edge, amber eyes fixed on Jake with unmistakable recognition. "Hello, Ledge," he said softly, remaining perfectly still. The bobcat sat on her haunches, maintaining the considerable distance between them, close enough to observe but well beyond what she would consider threatening. For nearly 20 minutes, they remained in this silent communion as the sun sank behind the mountains. Just as twilight deepened into dusk, the bobcat rose and turned back toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, she paused for one final glance back at the human whose life had become intertwined with hers through chance and circumstance. Jake raised his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement. The bobcat blinked slowly, what cat behaviorists recognize as a sign of trust, before disappearing into her woodland domain. In the years that followed, Jake Monroe became a regular advocate for wildlife conservation in Pinewood, working with city planners to establish protected corridors that allowed wild animals to navigate around human development safely. The story of his rescue spread, embellished in the retelling until it achieved almost mythical status among local conservation groups. Occasionally, during his visits to the forest edge, Jake would glimpse a now mature female bobcat observing him from a distance, never approaching, never fully revealed, but present nonetheless. Whether it was always the same animal, he couldn't be certain, but he liked to believe it was Ledge, maintaining their unlikely connection across the boundary that separated their worlds. The tale of the officer and the bobcat became a reminder to the residents of Pinewood that compassion could transcend species, that an act of kindness might return in unexpected ways, and that the wild heart of nature still beats strongly alongside their human community, separate but inexorably connected.